Okay, so by the time you guys are watching this, Thanksgiving should be over. So I hope everyone had a happy Thanksgiving. Listening or watching this. So today I'm gonna get kind of into the heavy-ish portion of part of this podcast, which is we're gonna start talking about what I called the Plight of Appalachia, or the what starts the opioid epidemic. And this is going to be a two-parter, just because there is a lot of information that goes into this, because you kind of have to get the backstory first, and then can get into when the epidemic kind of started, which wasn't really until like the late 90s. So in retrospect, it's really not been that long this has been going on. And when I say the Plight of Appalachia, and if anyone is listening to this that lives further north or out west, yes, I say Appalachia, not Appalachian. I'm from what is the central part of Appalachia, and we say that, and we'll continue to say it that way. So it is what it is. Which is the portion of Appalachia that I'll be focusing on, Central Appalachia, which is West Virginia, Southwest Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, and then parts of Northeast Tennessee, which Northeast Tennessee is where I am originally from. A lot of this does focus on Eastern Kentucky and Southwest Virginia, or well, West Virginia, maybe some parts of Southwest Virginia, just because they are, here in my mouth, they are the most poverty stricken, like the poverty level and the poverty rate in that part is actually surprisingly higher than Northeast Tennessee. And I think part of that is because Northeast Tennessee, for those that don't know, has a very large plant. The Eastman Chemical Company has one of their North American operations there that hires out quite a large portion of that area. We also have the Bristol Motor Speedway, which brings in, quite a bit. And there's a very large hospital chain. One of the top heart hospitals is in part of that region. So parts of Northeast Tennessee are doing a little bit better than West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky. So to really get this started, I do have a few little notes to kind of put into perspective what the poverty level is in Central Appalachia. There are 17% of Central Appalachia are at or below the poverty line. And that is in comparison to 12% of the US. So that's pretty huge. For those of you who are getting to watch this on YouTube, one of my cats will probably be jumping around. So I'll try not to get distracted. The average income in Central Appalachia is $51,000 for a household. The national average is $62,000, but it's a lot less than that in most places, especially, again, Eastern Kentucky and West Virginia. It's more likely to be in the $20,000 to $30,000 range, and that's not for a single household. That is a mother with children. It's like a single mom household. It can be that too. So when you really put it into perspective, as a single person, as a young person that makes maybe $25,000, $30,000 a year, you can do it. You can live off of it. in certain places. But when you are a mother who is taking care of, 1, 2, 3 children, it's not enough. It's not enough to pay your rent. It's not enough to pay your utilities. It's not enough to pay, if you have to put gas in a car to get to and from work, it's not enough to get groceries. And which is why a lot of Central Appalachia rely on, the welfare system and food stamps. And I know a lot of people are like, oh, these people have cell phones and they do this and they buy a car on. There's always going to be somebody that might rig the system, but when it comes to places like this, no, it's not like that. It's a necessity. And I actually watched a YouTube documentary on, it's like the channel AJ Plus, I think, and it was entitled Surviving Off of Peanut Butter and Crackers. And it talked about in West Virginia how, before the pandemic, it was bad. During the pandemic, when the restrictions on like the line of what you could make to be on food stamps were lifted, were raised, it got a little better. And then once everything started to open back up and all those restrictions were put back on, it got to be worse. And there was one particular woman who had been getting, I think, like $500 worth of food stamps, which most people are like, oh my God, that's a lot. She had 3 kids and herself, and it was barely enough to feed. Like, she would go without and to make sure that her kids had food. And she worked a job. And unfortunately, like after the pandemic, I don't know if it was that she got a small raise, and we're not talking to a lot of money. She got maybe a small raise, and her food stamps were dropped down to like $200 maybe. That makes them end up relying on food pantries. And during the pandemic, the food pantries couldn't get everything that they needed, because food pantries also rely on donations. They rely on, monetary donations. They also rely on donations from people, like giving them food. And what a lot of people don't understand is when you donate to a food bank, really, you need to think about who you're donating to. Like, they talk about how like everybody wants to donate macaroni and cheese because it's easy. Some of these people don't have pots to boil the water in to make the mac and cheese, or they may have like a stove, but they may not have a microwave, so they can't make the microwavable ones. Like, if you're going to donate if you're going to donate canned foods, donate some can openers, because a lot of them may not have can openers. Like, so it's really like, it's touch and go for like some of these food pantries to be able to like offer their services to everyone, because some of them, it is food, but some of them may not be able to cook it. They may not be able to open it. They may not be able to make it. So, I think that was part of the reason it was called Surviving Off of Peanut Butter and Crackers, because that's what a lot of them got. And that's what a lot of these parents that their food stamps got cut, they were eating peanut butter and crackers to make sure that their kids had enough to eat. And during the last administration, they wanted to cut federal funding for these social welfare programs. And places like West Virginia were getting hit the hardest. And there was a lady named Amy Jo Hutchison. She said one of the most poignant things that I have ever heard, and that is that, poverty isn't a character. It's not a character flaw. It's a circumstance. So basically, they're victims of a circumstance that they're in. And I know people think, oh, well, they can change their circumstance. No, what you have to understand about Central Appalachia is that there are no metropolitan hubs. There is no easy way to go somewhere else to get a different job. They relied, for many, 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 many years, they relied on the coal mining system. Because, it's a mountainous region. There's no bigger cities. They relied on coal mining. They don't have the best educational system. So many people don't graduate high school. they're lucky really to get through like maybe 6th, 7th, 8th grade. I know my grandparents on my dad's side, he like neither one of them made it past like I think maybe 6th or 7th grade. And he worked in the coal mine, and she took care of the kids. And so in that region, it's just that's how your heritage is, that's where your family is. And if you are not able to make it out to get somewhere else, you're stuck in that cycle. And that's why the poverty level stays where it's at, because many of them were, working in the same places that their parents worked, or working in the same places that their grandparents worked. And when coal mining really fell, when, different resources for electricity came through and the coal mining system really fell, that's when, it hit the hardest. And many families really couldn't make it. So like there's not a lot of choices. So they do really rely on these social welfare programs. And in the degree that I'm in public administration, it talks a lot about that the country was really set up in a way, obviously to protect its citizens, but to also protect those that, are I don't want to say the weakest among us, but, those that are in need. It's kind of set up like that. And that's what these social welfare programs are. And people are like, well, it's funny to me, because the same people that are like, well, I don't want my taxes to pay for these people to sit on their butts and, not do anything, when in reality they're working. They're just not making a living. So they're having to rely on this too, or they might be unable to work for some reason that, quite frankly, is nobody's business but their own. But they might not be able to work. And it's the same people who are like, well, I don't want my taxes to pay for this welfare program of theirs, that are, I hate to say, but they're the ones that are sitting in church that are like, oh, we gotta give to the poor. We gotta make sure the poor have something. We don't want to pay taxes so they can live off the government, but we'll give them something. Like, that just, to me, is such hypocrisy. Yeah. And also, to be fair, like, a lot of these people that are working are also paying taxes. So they're also paying into the system. But what you don't understand is that it's not only the revenue from your taxes that goes to fund these social welfare programs. There are other ways that the government funds. And social welfare programs are really a small percentage of the federal budget in comparison to, other things. So it's really like, it's not as much as people think that it is. So, but yeah, like that documentary, like I honestly sat and cried, because it broke my heart that these people are having to live with and having to deal with what they're having to deal with. And, like I said, what she said was just so poignant. She basically was also saying that, like, the government, because the way the government put that they wanted to cut these programs, it made it seem like the people who were living or were having to use these programs were doing something wrong. And they're not doing anything wrong. It's, 99.9% of the time, it's not their fault that they're in that situation. They've lived their whole life there, and there's no way out. And it's just an endless cycle. It's the circumstance that they were put in. And it's unfortunately a circumstance that was brought on by, an industrial boom that missed out on a region. Like, when other regions were booming, when other regions were making money, when there was, cities getting built. And that's not to say that there aren't. I mean, obviously West Virginia has, their capital city is, a lot of northern West Virginia is, can be a little bit more metro, but like, closer into the mountains, there's, there's really like, there's no way for these people to get out. They don't have the money to be able to move. What a lot of people don't understand is they're like, why don't we just get up and go? To be able to move, first of all, you have to be able to find a place to work. Then you have to come up with the money somehow to get a place to live. You may or may not have to get a car that can actually get you there. And these people don't have the startup. They don't have the money to do that because they don't. And people are like, why don't they save? They can't. They're providing for their families. They're not able to save money. Like, that's what people don't understand. And people are like, oh, well, $50,000 should be enough. Most of them don't make that. And those that do end up having, higher rates for their utilities, maybe have a car payment. They're barely making it as well. But, in reality, most of that part of Eastern Kentucky and West Virginia and Southwest Virginia are not making anywhere close to that. And it's not enough. And so again, they rely on these, these social welfare programs to be able to eat, to be able to pay their bills, to be able to make sure that their kids are okay. And unfortunately, part of their kids being okay is, yeah, they're in school, but they're not maybe necessarily in a great education system. And, it's not necessarily the fault of the people of that area. A lot of it has to do with whether their local government is doing anything to help them, whether the state government is doing anything to help them. Usually places like that kind of get the shit into the deal. They don't get, what people have to realize is the federal government doesn't really dole out money to states like that. Like, obviously the states have their own revenue, local governments have their own revenue by city and state taxes. Well, that does include like, sales tax on things, so that they're getting it from that. But like, if you're expecting it from property tax, most of the people in Eastern Kentucky or West Virginia or Southwest Virginia don't own their own homes. So that is not a revenue that the local government's going to get. And so like when the state does their budget, you have to look at like the capital cities, the bigger cities. Obviously they have a higher population, but they're the cities that are going to get the most money, the most resources. And smaller towns kind of get left out. And so like, there's no reform to the education system. There's no help for employment, like to get employment in like a different, field or area. And so again, they're kind of just stuck. And, that's unfortunately what brings us into the opioid epidemic and how it really plays a part, a huge part in Central Appalachia. And I mean, obviously there are drug issues all over the US. And, like meth is a huge issue in the South all the way up, throughout the US. Meth is a huge issue. And there's a lot of cooking of meth, especially in rural parts of Tennessee. There's a lot. But meth is not really, it's not an opioid, so they don't really consider it part of this, even though it is a huge issue. But when we're talking about the opioid crisis, we're actually talking about prescription opioids, and then heroin does come into play, because unfortunately in the last several years, black tar heroin has actually made its way into the region. And it is unfortunately cheaper for people to get their hands on heroin than it is for them to either be prescribed or buy the prescription opioids, which are things like oxycodone, hydrocodone, Oxycontin, things like that. But really we'll probably be kind of focusing more on the prescription strength, because that's kind of what was the catalyst that started it all. And then in the second portion, I will talk about, things that could, not necessarily things that could have helped prevent it, even though there are things that could have helped prevent it, but things that could be done to maybe help get the region out of this like super dark hole that it's gotten into. Because obviously they can't get out themselves. And there are a lot of reasons why it has affected this region so poorly, and why so many people have gotten addicted to it. But so we'll kind of start because, like I said, it didn't really have a grasp or take hold until like the late 90s. Because before the late 90s, there was guidelines for when and how prescription strength opioids were dealt out. But like, so Percocet and Vicodin actually came about, which are two painkillers, prescription painkillers. They came about in the mid to late 70s. Obviously before then, like, from the 1800s on, there was, opium, they had morphine, they had codeine that was in, cough medicine. But in the 70s, that's when, things like Percocet and Vicodin came about, which were really just for terminally like ill cancer patients who were in chronic pain. But during the 70s and 80s, there was really this huge stigma, especially around something like a prescription pain pill that had, a narcotic, like an opiate in it. And a lot of that was because many people don't know, many younger people don't know, but like, obviously Woodstock, the free love, there was acid, LSD, PCP. I never really count marijuana in this because to me, marijuana is really not I don't think of it as a drug. It's, it's something natural. It has properties that help people, in pain, medically. It helps people with anxiety. Like, to me, it's not, I see nothing wrong with it. But, and then during the 70s, obviously crack, 80s, there was a lot of cocaine, like a lot of the movies that you see, like, Wolf of Wall Street, stuff like that, or even like Taxi Driver, that wasn't completely untrue. There was a lot of crack and a lot of cocaine going on in the, late 70s, early 80s, mid 80s. And you also have to think about who was in office at the time. In the 80s with Reagan in office, he had this huge war on drugs, which unfortunately was a little bit racially motivated. I don't want to say a little bit, it was probably all racially motivated, because of the time period that it was in. But there was this huge like war on drugs, and there were huge consequences for people who used and or sold drugs that were not prescribed to them, or man-made drugs from the street. And so really in that time, big pharma was, they were there, but they were not, like these prescription pills were not huge. And it was between like 1976 and 1986 that Percocet and Vicodin actually got approved by the FDA. And then in the early and late 80s, there were, like I said, there were guidelines by the World Health Organization of who could get these prescription opioids. And it was, again, for cancer patients who had chronic pain. I don't know about, because this was about the time of HIV. So I don't know if they were used for that or not. But I know it was mostly for cancer patients as a way to treat their chronic pain. So those people who were injured or who had other forms of chronic pain during that time, doctors would use things like nerve blocking surgeries or perform surgeries on, the part that got injured before, and they would use like non-pharmaceutical methods like to treat it before, they actually went into the prescription store, but what changed wasn't just big pharma coming into play, because there was a pharmaceutical company. I won't say the name because I don't want to get in trouble, but it's not like it's not out there. But there was a pharmaceutical company who spent, probably $200 million on a campaign to promote OxyContin to pharmacists, to hospitals, and doctors as a way to treat chronic pain without performing surgery. So big pharma was a huge part of it, but it was also too, at the time, hospitals were realizing that a lot of these people who were in chronic pain or who had gotten injured were not able, either didn't have insurance, because at the time it wasn't like it is now where you can get fined if you don't have health insurance, and there was no health insurance market. It was you either had health insurance from where you worked or you didn't have it. And at the time, they were realizing like, we're losing out on all this money, because if a person has this surgery and they don't pay or they don't make their payments, like, yes, you can get, you'll have bill collectors on your ass all the time, but there weren't really as many consequences for it. So the hospitals were losing out on money, and when the hospitals lose out on money, obviously they have to start cutting staff, they have to start cutting programs, they don't have as much, they weren't able to get like, technology that they need. And so when this pharmaceutical company started pushing OxyContin, it also helped give kickbacks to the hospitals and the doctors who prescribed it to their patients. And so that meant that the hospitals weren't going to be out X amount of dollars for doing a surgery. They were also going to get a kickback from the pharmaceutical company to where they could get that new technology. They could, build more wings. They could add more staff. It was really kind of a plus for the hospitals to do, for the doctor's offices to do, because it was kind of a one-shot deal. It was, oh, you have this chronic pain here, let's treat it with this instead of, performing this surgery. And I'm not blaming doctors, I'm not blaming hospitals. A lot of this is in part big pharma, because to me, it's almost how the people feel about the vaccines that have happened. They feel like there wasn't enough research done. There was research done on, obviously, on these prescription pain pills, but I don't think that they fully let people know how, and I'm talking about the general public, I don't necessarily mean the doctors, they didn't let people fully know how addictive these painkillers can be. I mean, obviously, like when you use morphine, before a surgery or something like that, you run the risk of somebody who's been on it for a very long time having a dependency on it. And that's the same thing with these prescription strength pills, especially if you are predisposed to an addiction, because addiction is a disease, and there is, it can be a mental health issue, and it can really start out with a chemical imbalance. And when your body feels good and your mind feels good, you need that chemical inhibitor to make sure that you continue to stay feeling good. And I think that that's where the disconnect was. And I think that that's where partially it is a fault of big pharma and the hospitals and the staff for not really, before they had these guidelines, now they don't really have them. And because, in that time, it was, probably a different administration. There was a little lessening of, government was obviously getting kickbacks too. Come on, let's be real. Big pharma gives a lot of kickbacks to government. So they were getting kickbacks too. So there was really, the fact that it was maybe a possibility that there was this like chance that somebody could get addicted to it was not large enough for them to say, okay, hold up, you need to try all of this. We'll keep these guidelines. You need to try all of this before you start to prescribe this to someone. And so that's kind of what started it, was when Big Pharma introduced Oxycontin. And we all know the story of the family who, promoted it and came up with it and what they're facing now, which, as they should. But that's really kind of what started it. And yes, this was a nationwide thing. This was a nationwide, all hospitals, all doctors were, promoting this painkiller, prescription painkiller. And it even shows in between the late 90s. So between the late 90s and the early 2000s, within maybe a 5 or 6 year period, there was an increase of, prescriptions for morphine, for fentanyl, for oxycodone, for, several other drugs. Oxycodone prescriptions increased by 400% in that 5 year period. And that's a huge increase. And what that says to me is the hospitals were saying, okay, and that's not saying that everyone that was injured didn't have, surgery or didn't have physical therapy. It was very much probably those who, it wasn't a life-threatening injury. So it was something that was just maybe chronic pain that they could treat with that. And that says to me that a lot of people, that was getting pushed on a lot of people. And why it affected the portion of Central Appalachia in the greatest was because many people in Central Appalachia were still in manual labor type jobs. So, and they didn't have health insurance and didn't have the means to pay for, a nerve blocking surgery or physical therapy. So the doctors at the time just would prescribe them these pills. And unfortunately, what happens is that a lot of these people would be out of work completely. They would have to go on disability and they would get addicted to the pills, and they would start to buy them out on the street. And unfortunately, when they couldn't get a hold of the pills, that's when things like heroin come into play. And like I said, it's only been maybe in the last decade or so, maybe a little before that, black tar heroin came into the region. And it's cheaper for them to get that than it is for them to get either by prescription, or if their prescription's been cut off because the doctor has written them too many prescriptions, and they can't get it from someone on the streets, or they don't look to go to a methadone clinic to get off of, get out of the addiction. So when they turn to heroin. And, in the next part, I will talk about things that kind of have happened in our region and, Eastern Kentucky, like needle exchange programs, things that are working to try to get things better, but, still need exposure, still need a lot of help. But really for this episode, I didn't want it to be super long. I didn't want it to be, I didn't want to do a 3-hour episode, because it's really, I could talk about this stuff for, several hours. But, in the next episode, I'll really get into the mid 2000s and till now, and show you how many prescriptions are out there in Central Appalachia or all of Appalachia versus, the rest of the US. Because Appalachia runs, the whole of it runs from Pennsylvania down through to Georgia. But really the focus, the most poverty stricken and those that have been the most affected by this epidemic, are really in that central part. Although I know there's some parts of Pennsylvania that are kind of experiencing the same thing too. Maybe some parts of Georgia. It's just the most known is like Eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, and Southwest Virginia, and some parts of Northeast Tennessee too, that are really kind of hit the hardest, and are kind of the most poverty stricken. Because if you see anything, like if you've seen the geography of where it's at, that little hub, it's all surrounded, like it's in the mountains, and there's no central, like obviously Kentucky has, they have Lexington not far out of Eastern Kentucky, but it's still quite a drive. And, at least with East Tennessee, we do have, it's a little bit closer because we are closer to like Knoxville or Chattanooga, or it's not very far from Nashville, and it's kind of easier for us to get there. But West Virginia really only has maybe a few spots, maybe the capital, maybe Morgantown. And then Southwest Virginia, there's, Southwest Virginia is not the same as Northern Virginia. There's a huge difference between Southwest Virginia and Northern Virginia. Even Central Virginia, there's a fairly large difference. So it's really hard, again, like I said, it's really hard for these people to get out and to get to places where they can, where they can get the help they need, where they are able to find work that is sufficient enough to let them make a living and take care of their kids. And, a lot of them don't want to leave a home that they're used to. A lot of them don't want to leave the area that they're used to because, that's where their family is. That's where, that's where generations have grown up. And, it's not to say that people need to leave, but maybe we need to bring something there. Maybe we need to bring a change, not that's going to change their heritage or change the way that they've lived. Obviously they're very family oriented, but something needs to give for them to get out of the throes of this epidemic and to get out of that super poverty that they're in, and to make it better for the upcoming generation, to make it better for their kids. Because if not, it's just an endless cycle. And again, they're a victim of the circumstance, and these kids are a victim of the circumstance. And if the kids can't get out, and if the kids can't get the help that they need, it's just, again, it's going to continue to be an endless cycle. You'll have a new generation that's addicted. You'll have a new generation that the poverty level continues to increase. And so, that's for part two. That's really more of what I'll get into, like the policies that I think can help change it, and the policies that could help bring opportunities, whether it is making more of a social welfare program, something to get them on their feet, something to help out, whether it's, having new industries come into the area, because there's plots of land. There's huge pieces of land that these places could come into, and they would have people who could work. And so whether it's that, or, figuring out a way to help the education system, and making sure that kids can get all the way through, that kids can graduate, and that if kids want to go to college, that they have the opportunity. And, fortunately, Tennessee has made, and a lot of other places have made, this program where you can go for the first 2 years of college at, I don't know if it's at all universities or if it's just at technical schools, which is great because you can get all your gen ed out of the way and you're not in debt. Like, you can go for free. And so, I don't know if Eastern Kentucky or West Virginia has that, program. I think Southwest Virginia does. Well, all of Virginia does. So it's, it's little things like that that can help make a change. And, for those out there that are like, well, why should we care about this? Why should we do that? Because you should care about other people. You should care about what's happening, especially if you're from around here. I mean, these could be people that are your neighbors that are going through this. And isn't that a lot of what this area, what your faith is about? Like helping those that are, I don't want to say the lowest among us, but those that are in need the most. And I mean, the opioid epidemic isn't just affecting the most poverty stricken. There are teens in this area, whose parents may have money that are finding a way to get it too. So it can affect anyone. It's just harder for those who are in such a poverty stricken area to get out of. And so, like I said, that's the part 2 portion of this will be, again, from like probably 2006, 2007 on to today, how it's grown, how it's gotten worse, what local communities have tried to do to combat it, what's working, what's not, what could possibly be done as far as in Congress or, even in state governments, what policies could be put into place to help combat this. Like, is it time for government to go after big pharma? I know that's a hot button issue and that's a hard one to fight, but something's got to give. So that will be part 2, which I will post up in about a week. Hope you guys had a great Thanksgiving and a good start to the holidays.